An elderly black woman is humiliatingly forced to kneel in the middle of the street. The police officers revel in their power, while the crowd around them silently watches. But one unexpected event changes everything. How far can impunity go, and what happens when someone decides to break the silence? Subscribe to find out the sequel and write in the comments where you're watching from. Martha adjusted her worn scarf against the chilly evening breeze as she strolled home from the small-town library, her usual destination after a long day of volunteer work. At 71, she had long since earned the respect of those around her. Known for her warm smile and wise demeanor, Martha exuded a quiet strength that belied the struggles she had faced over the decades. She had lived in this town her entire life, watching it change slowly, seeing new faces, new buildings, and yet some things seemed like they'd never change at all. The sun had set only moments ago, leaving behind streaks of deep orange and purple in the sky, casting the town in a gentle twilight glow. Normally, she found comfort in the familiar sights of the small southern town, with its brick buildings and oak-lined streets. But tonight, an unsettling feeling prickled at the back of her mind. The roads seemed emptier than usual, and the usual sounds of evening chatter and distant traffic felt muffled, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Her walk took her through a small, nearly deserted park, one she'd traversed countless times before. Fallen leaves scattered along the path crackled underfoot, breaking the stillness, and as she passed the ancient fountain in the center of the park, Martha's sense of unease grew. The fountain, with its chipped stonework and ivy creeping along its base, was a familiar landmark, a comforting relic of her childhood. But tonight it felt ominous, its silent water like an eye staring back at her. She quickened her steps, telling herself not to be foolish, but the feeling persisted. Rounding a corner, she noticed a lone patrol car parked a short distance away, its headlights cutting through the dim light. The car's presence was strange. This part of town rarely saw much police activity, especially not in the quiet hours of evening. Martha's heart beat a little faster, a faint echo of old fears, memories she'd long buried but never truly forgotten. She had spent her whole life navigating the subtleties of prejudice, understanding when to be silent, when to stand tall, and when to remove herself from a situation entirely. Still, as she drew closer, she couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. Trying to keep her composure, Martha continued walking, casting only a quick glance at the patrol car. The officers inside seemed engrossed in conversation, but one of them, a stocky man with a sharp gaze, turned his head just as she passed. For a brief, chilling moment, their eyes met, and Martha felt a flash of something between curiosity and malice in his expression. Her instincts told her to look away, but she held his gaze a moment longer, her resolve refusing to waver. Then she turned back to her path, determined not to let the silent threat intimidate her. Yet the feeling of being followed grew stronger with each step. It was more than just a sensation. It was the culmination of years of learned caution, of knowing how quickly circumstances could shift from peaceful to perilous. Her pace quickened as she neared the edge of the park, her eyes focused on the distant lights of home just a few blocks away. But before she could reach the main road, the patrol car rolled forward, its headlights now fully illuminating her path. Martha froze, her hands clenching the strap of her bag as the car stopped directly beside her. The doors opened in unison, and two officers stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators closing in on prey. The man who had locked eyes with her earlier was now directly in her path, and she felt a wave of dread settle over her. His name tag read Green, and his expression was one of thinly veiled contempt. His partner, a younger officer with a slightly uncertain look in his eyes, followed closely behind but kept his gaze averted, as if uncomfortable with what was about to unfold. "Evening, ma'am," Officer Green said, his tone overly polite, a mocking undertone threading through the words. "Out for a stroll, are we?" Martha forced a calm smile, though her heart was racing. "Yes, officer. Just heading home after my shift at the library." Green raised an eyebrow, looking her up and down as though appraising her. "A bit late for a woman your age to be out alone, don't you think?" "I'm used to it," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lived here all my life. I know the streets better than most." "Oh, I don't doubt that," Green said with a smirk. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "But you see, there's been some suspicious activity in this area recently, and it's my job to keep things safe. You understand that, don't you?" Martha felt her pulse quicken. She could sense where this conversation was headed, but she held her ground. "I understand that, officer, but I haven't done anything wrong." Green's smirk widened. "Funny, isn't it? How the ones who claim innocence always have something to hide." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a wary glance at Green. "Maybe we should let her go, officer," he murmured, but Green silenced him with a glare. Martha's heart sank. She had seen men like Green before, men who wielded authority like a weapon, who thrived on intimidation and fear. She had spent her life learning how to navigate around people like him, but tonight the years felt heavy on her shoulders. She sensed that Green had no intention of letting her walk away without a fight. "You know," Green said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone, "respect goes a long way. And from where I'm standing, it looks like you've got a lot to learn in that department." He paused, letting the words sink in, then continued, "Maybe you should get down on your knees and apologize. Show a little humility." The words hit her like a slap. Martha felt her cheeks burn, the indignity of the demand mingling with a sharp, bitter anger. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, demanding submission, stripping away her dignity in front of everyone. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the aggressive stance of the officers. People watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Martha swallowed, struggling to keep her voice calm. "I have nothing to apologize for," she said quietly, but firmly. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the collective judgment and indifference that seemed to surround her. Green's expression hardened. He took another step closer, forcing her to back up until she felt the rough bark of a tree against her spine. "Oh, I think you do, ma'am, because if you don't, things might get a little unpleasant for all of us." Martha's mind raced, memories flooding her thoughts, scenes from her childhood, moments when she had witnessed her parents facing similar situations, her father's quiet defiance, her mother's whispered words of courage. She had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like these, but now, faced with Green's unyielding gaze and the expectant crowd, she felt a wave of helplessness threaten to overtake her. Slowly, reluctantly, she dropped to one knee, feeling the cold, unforgiving ground press against her. The humiliation washed over her, a bitter taste that filled her mouth as she looked up at Green, who watched her with a triumphant smile. "See?" he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" The crowd murmured, a mixture of shock, disgust, and helplessness rippling through them. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight. Others simply stared, as if transfixed by the spectacle of a proud woman brought low. But as Martha knelt there, she felt something shift within her, a spark of resistance igniting in her chest. She was no stranger to humiliation, to being made to feel less than human, but this time she would not let it break her. She would remember this moment, hold on to it, and use it as fuel for the battles yet to come. As the officers finally backed away, leaving her kneeling on the cold ground, Martha knew that this was only the beginning. Martha rose slowly from the ground, the cold dampness of the earth clinging to her knee as she steadied herself, aware that every eye in the gathering crowd was fixed on her. She avoided their gazes, unwilling to let anyone see the shame and pain that simmered beneath her calm exterior. The humiliation she had just endured felt like a fresh wound, but deep within her, a fierce resolve was building. She knew all too well that submission, however forced, was only another form of survival. Yet, each moment of that survival came at a heavy cost, eroding her dignity bit by bit. As she straightened, Officer Green stood with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression of smug satisfaction. His younger partner looked away, shifting uncomfortably, his face a mask of unease as though he was wrestling with a conflict he couldn't express. The crowd murmured, their collective discomfort palpable, yet none stepped forward to break the oppressive silence. Martha saw several people in the crowd avert their eyes, either unwilling or unable to face the injustice unfolding before them. Martha's mind reeled with memories from decades before, scenes from her youth when she had marched, protested, and endured countless insults, threats, and assaults. She had believed, in the deepest part of her heart, that those battles had been fought and won, that her lifetime of struggle had led to real change. And yet, here she was again, in front of a crowd of silent witnesses, facing an all too familiar enemy. The bitter irony of it twisted within her like a knife, but she took a deep breath, refusing to let despair take hold. Green tilted his head, his smirk fading slightly as he seemed to notice the look in her eyes, the barely contained spark of defiance. "What's the matter?" he sneered. "Didn't expect a little humility to be so hard?" Martha met his gaze with steely resolve, forcing herself to stand tall. "I'm not here to cause trouble, officer," she said quietly, but there was an unmistakable edge to her words. "I've lived in this town longer than you, and I know right from wrong." "Is that so?" Green's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you think you're above the law, but out here, respect is earned, not given, and you're still a long way from earning it, lady." The younger officer, standing slightly behind Green, cleared his throat. "Maybe we should move on, Officer Green. I don't think she's—" Green cut him off with a withering glare. "I don't pay you to think, Andrews, so why don't you let me handle this?" Andrews opened his mouth as if to protest, but quickly closed it, his shoulders slumping slightly as he looked away. Martha observed this exchange closely, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this young officer, Andrews, had not yet grown numb to the cruelty that Green so clearly thrived on. She stored this observation away, determined to remember it in case she might need an ally, even a reluctant one, in the future. Around them, the crowd continued to grow, a silent mass of townsfolk who had gathered out of curiosity, or perhaps even guilt, but none who dared to speak up. In the front row of onlookers, Martha recognized a familiar face, a young man named Jacob, who often came to the library where she volunteered. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, and for a moment their gazes met. Martha saw a flicker of something in his expression, a glimmer of empathy, perhaps even of courage, but it faded quickly as he looked away, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. Green seemed to sense the shift in the crowd's mood, the uneasy murmurs that had begun to ripple through them. He took a step back, surveying the onlookers with a challenging glare. "What are you all looking at?" he snapped, his voice laced with contempt. "You've got something to say? Anyone here think they know the law better than me?" No one responded. The crowd, cowed and uneasy, avoided his gaze. Green's smirk returned, and he turned his attention back to Martha, satisfied that his authority remained unquestioned. "See?" he said softly, as if speaking only to her. "No one here is going to help you. They're all just here to watch." Martha's heart ached with disappointment as she looked at the people she had called neighbors, friends, and even family. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, a reminder that, in times of true conflict, people often turned inward, choosing safety over solidarity. But despite the fear and shame, she refused to let Green's words strip away her dignity. Without warning, Green reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip rough and unyielding. "You think you're some kind of martyr?" he whispered, his voice low and threatening. "I could have you locked up right now. Who would stop me?" Martha's pulse quickened as his words sank in. She knew he could make good on his threat, knew that any resistance could escalate the situation beyond control. But a fire burned within her, one that she had kept alive for all these years. She had endured too much, sacrificed too much, to let herself be intimidated by a man like Green. Taking a steadying breath, she looked him directly in the eyes. "You might have the badge, officer, but you don't have my respect. That's something you'll never earn." Green's face contorted in anger, his fingers digging into her arm painfully as he tightened his grip. The tension was palpable, a fragile moment teetering on the edge of violence. The crowd watched, silent and fearful, as the scene unfolded before them, and then, from the back of the crowd, a voice rang out, clear and strong, "Leave her alone." Everyone turned to look as a young woman stepped forward, her expression fierce and resolute. Martha recognized her as Sarah, one of the newer residents in town. Sarah had moved here only a few months prior, but had quickly become known for her outspoken stance on social justice issues, a rarity in this quiet, conservative town. Sarah was younger, perhaps in her early 30s, with a quiet strength that reminded Martha of herself in her youth. Green turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who won't stand by and watch this happen," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "What you're doing is wrong, and you know it." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd as Sarah's words cut through the tension. Martha felt a surge of gratitude toward this young woman who, despite the odds, had chosen to stand with her. Sarah's defiance was a spark, a reminder that there were still people willing to speak out against injustice, even when it was easier to remain silent. Green's jaw tightened, and he released Martha's arm, stepping toward Sarah with an intimidating glare. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" he demanded, his voice dripping with hostility. "You think you know what it takes to keep this town safe? What you're doing has nothing to do with safety." Sarah shot back, her gaze unflinching. "It's about control, about making someone feel small because you can, and I won't stand for it." Martha watched in awe as Sarah held her ground, her words resonating with a quiet strength that was both familiar and inspiring. Sarah's courage reignited the hope within her, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. For a moment, the years melted away, and Martha felt like a young woman once more, standing shoulder to shoulder with others who shared her convictions. Green's face twisted in anger, but he seemed to recognize the futility of further confrontation. The crowd, emboldened by Sarah's defiance, was beginning to shift, murmurs of agreement breaking through the silence. He shot one last hateful look at Martha before turning to his partner. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice low and sullen. Andrews looked relieved, his face softening as he glanced at Martha with a mixture of sympathy and regret. As the officers retreated to their patrol car, the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and disgust lingering in the air. Martha remained rooted to the spot, her heart pounding as the tension slowly ebbed away. Sarah approached her, her expression softening as she placed a reassuring hand on Martha's shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Martha nodded, her voice catching in her throat as she struggled to find the right words. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the weight of gratitude and relief settle over her. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up." Sarah smiled, a warm, encouraging expression that filled Martha with a sense of hope. "Sometimes it only takes one person to make a difference," she replied softly. "You've spent your life standing up for others, Martha. It's about time someone stood up for you." Martha felt a lump form in her throat, touched by Sarah's words and the strength of her conviction. She looked around at the now empty street, the remnants of the confrontation lingering in the cool evening air. The pain and humiliation were still fresh, but she knew that tonight had been a turning point, a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, and that, even in her later years, she was not alone in this struggle. As she and Sarah walked away side by side, Martha felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would not be silenced, nor would she let the injustices of the past define her future. With allies like Sarah by her side, she knew that the battle was far from over, and that together they could forge a path toward a better tomorrow. Martha walked away from the park with Sarah by her side, each step carrying the weight of humiliation, tempered slightly by the young woman's courageous intervention. Sarah's presence was a relief, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, there were people willing to stand up for what was right. But the anger and shame from her encounter with Officer Green still simmered beneath the surface, casting a shadow over the small comfort she felt. The events of that evening had left a bitter taste, and Martha couldn't help but replay Green's words in her mind. She had felt the raw intent behind them, the deep-seated prejudice that seemed to ooze from his every gesture. In her long life, she had seen many faces like his, faces twisted with hatred and disdain, faces that seemed to revel in the pain they inflicted. But tonight, for the first time in years, she had been forced to endure it all over again, reminded that the battles she thought were behind her were still lurking, just waiting for an opportunity to resurface. As they neared her small weathered home on the edge of town, Sarah touched Martha's arm gently, breaking her from her thoughts. "Martha, do you want me to come inside with you?" she asked softly. "I don't mind staying if you need someone to talk to." Martha forced a smile, though her heart was still heavy. "I appreciate that, Sarah. I really do. But I think I just need a little time to myself." Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic. "If you change your mind, you know where to find me. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Martha's smile became a little warmer, the weight of gratitude lightening her spirits just a bit. "Thank you, Sarah. You don't know how much it means to me that you stood up back there." "It was the least I could do," Sarah replied. "People like Green, they're dangerous. And if we don't stand up to them, they'll keep doing this to people, to our friends, our neighbors." Martha nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting in her heart. "You're right. I've spent too much of my life turning the other cheek. But maybe it's time to start standing up again." With a final, reassuring squeeze of her hand, Sarah departed, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts. The silence of her home felt heavy, pressing in around her as she moved through the small, dimly lit rooms. She could still feel the sharp sting of Green's words, the way he had looked at her with that cold, calculated cruelty. It was as if he had taken pleasure in reducing her and stripping away her dignity for everyone to see. In the quiet solitude of her living room, Martha sat down, letting herself feel the full weight of the day's events. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to moments when she had been forced to endure similar treatment. Memories she had long tried to bury began to surface, unbidden, yet painfully vivid. Moments from her youth, when she had been made to feel small, to apologize for her very existence, to pretend that she was somehow less deserving of respect and decency. She remembered her father, his strong hands gripping hers as he told her never to let anyone take away her pride. She recalled her mother's quiet resilience, the way she had endured so much with a grace that defied the cruelty of the world around her. Those memories brought a small sense of comfort, but they also reminded her of the unspoken promise she had made to herself so many years ago, a promise that she would never again allow anyone to strip her of her dignity. As the night wore on, Martha found herself growing restless. She knew that she couldn't simply sit back and accept what had happened, but she also knew that standing up against someone like Green wouldn't be easy. Men like him held the power of the badge, and the entire town seemed to turn a blind eye to their actions. Martha had spent a lifetime fighting, but this time felt different. She was older now, tired from years of struggle, and the thought of facing Green again filled her with a deep, gnawing dread. The following morning, Martha woke early, her mind still clouded by the events of the previous evening. She spent her morning routine in a fog, her thoughts scattered and heavy. But as she went about her chores, a sense of resolve began to settle over her. She could no longer afford to let people like Green continue unchecked. If she stayed silent now, it would only embolden him, making it easier for him to victimize others. Her resolve was strengthened later that day when she ventured out to the local grocery store. As she browsed the shelves, she noticed the stares of a few familiar faces, neighbors and acquaintances who had clearly heard about the incident in the park. Some avoided her gaze, while others watched her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. The weight of their scrutiny made her feel small, as though she were once again kneeling on the cold ground, forced to endure their judgment. But then, as she rounded a corner near the produce section, she saw a familiar face. Jacob, the young man who had been in the crowd the previous night. He stood awkwardly by the apples, his hands fidgeting as he caught sight of her. Martha hesitated, unsure whether to approach him, but Jacob moved first, walking over with an expression of quiet determination. "Martha, I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have done something. I don't know, tried to stop him." Martha offered him a gentle smile, though the pain in her heart was still raw. "It's all right, Jacob. You were there. Sometimes just bearing witness is enough." He shook his head, his expression troubled. "I don't know if that's true. I could have stood up like Sarah did, but I was afraid." "Fear is a powerful thing," Martha replied softly. "It's kept a lot of people silent for a long time. But you're young, Jacob. You have time to learn and grow, and maybe next time you'll find the strength to speak up." Jacob looked at her, a flicker of hope lighting in his eyes. "Maybe," he murmured, "but you shouldn't have had to go through that. None of us should have to see it, let alone endure it." Martha nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude for Jacob's words. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small glimmer of support in a town that so often turned a blind eye to injustice. As they parted ways, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't allow Green's actions to go unchallenged. She owed it to herself, to her parents, and to all the people who had endured similar treatment over the years. Over the next few days, Martha began to prepare herself for the inevitable confrontation that she knew was coming. She started by reaching out to a few close friends, those who she knew shared her beliefs and her desire for justice. Quietly, she gathered support, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand with her. She knew that facing Green alone would be dangerous, but with the backing of the community, she stood a better chance of challenging his authority. However, Green seemed to sense her growing resolve, and his intimidation tactics began to escalate. He would drive by her house late at night, his patrol car's lights flashing ominously through her windows, or follow her on her errands, always making sure she was aware of his presence. The silent threat was clear. If she dared to speak out, he would make her life a living nightmare. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Martha was walking home from a meeting with Sarah and a few other supporters. As she made her way down the empty street, she noticed a familiar car parked at the corner. Her heart sank as she recognized Green's patrol vehicle, his shadowy form visible behind the wheel. He didn't approach her, but his mere presence was enough to send a chill down her spine. She quickened her pace, feeling the weight of his gaze as she hurried toward home. That night, Martha lay awake in bed, her mind racing with fear and anger. She knew that Green was trying to break her, to force her into submission through intimidation, but she also knew that giving in now would only make things worse. If she allowed him to win, it would be a victory not only for him, but for all those who thrived on fear and hatred. In the early hours of the morning, as dawn began to break over the town, Martha made a decision. She would no longer be a silent victim. She would stand up to Green, no matter the cost. She would call on the strength of her ancestors, the resilience of her parents, and the support of the few allies she had gathered. This fight would not be easy, but she was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, casting a warm, golden glow across her room, Martha felt a surge of determination. She had endured so much in her life, and she would endure this as well. With a deep breath, she rose from her bed, ready to face the battle that awaited her. Martha awoke with a quiet but fierce determination. The resolve she'd found in the early hours of the morning hadn't wavered. If anything, it had only grown stronger. She knew that Green's intimidation tactics would only intensify, that his threats would linger over her like a dark cloud. But Martha had decided, once and for all, that she would no longer bend to fear. It was time to stand firm. Her first step was to reach out to Sarah, who had shown such courage that night in the park. Sarah's support meant the world to Martha, not only for her defiance against Green, but for the simple act of solidarity. Martha felt certain that, with Sarah by her side, she could rally others to their cause. She had lived too long in silence, and now, with the courage of the younger generation standing with her, she felt her voice growing stronger. She called Sarah that morning, her voice steady and firm. "I've made up my mind," Martha told her. "I won't let Green get away with what he's doing, but I can't do it alone." Sarah didn't hesitate. "You don't have to, Martha. I'm with you. Whatever you need, we'll do it together." They decided to gather a small group of like-minded people, those who had experienced or witnessed injustice in town, but who, until now, had felt powerless to act. Martha knew that the key to facing Green lay in unity, in the collective strength of people who had grown tired of living in fear. With Sarah's help, she began to reach out to others, friends, neighbors, even strangers who had heard about what had happened and were eager to lend their support. The group met in the back room of a local community center that evening, a modest space filled with folding chairs and a few old, dusty posters about town events. But the humble setting couldn't dampen the energy in the room. Each person there held a story, a piece of the town's tapestry of unspoken prejudices and lingering fears. Some were hesitant at first, casting wary glances around the room, unsure of who they could trust. But as Martha began to speak, the doubt and fear started to dissolve. Martha shared her story with a quiet strength, recounting the events of that night with a frankness that left no room for pity. Her words painted a vivid picture of Green's intimidation and cruelty, of the cold satisfaction he'd taken in humiliating her. She spoke of the history she had carried with her, the weight of past struggles, and the desire to finally stand up to the forces that had kept her, and so many others, in silence for so long. As she spoke, the others in the room began to open up, sharing their own experiences. Some recounted run-ins with Green and other officers who seemed to think their badge gave them the right to act without consequence. Others spoke of the quiet racism that had festered in the town for years, of the small slights and indignities they had been forced to endure. There was Jacob, the young man who had watched in the park, whose face still bore traces of guilt. He spoke about the shame he felt for not stepping forward, for allowing fear to keep him silent. But Martha reassured him, telling him that courage was a journey and that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory in itself. And there was Emma, a single mother who had seen her teenage son stop by Green for no reason other than the color of his skin. She had felt powerless to protect him, knowing that any resistance could make things worse. She clutched Martha's hand as she spoke, her voice shaking but filled with a deep, unspoken strength. The room buzzed with shared stories and quiet affirmations. Each person's tale added a new layer to the tapestry of injustice they were building, a collective truth that they would no longer allow to be ignored. The energy in the room grew, a tangible force of solidarity and resolve, and Martha felt her own strength rising with each word. Together, they began to form a plan. They would approach the town council, demand a formal investigation into Green's actions, and gather signatures from the townspeople to show that they would no longer stand for abuse of power. The plan was simple, but it was a first step, a way to make their voices heard in a town that had too often turned a blind eye to its own failings. As the meeting wound down, Sarah pulled Martha aside. "We'll need more than signatures to bring Green down," she said quietly. "He has connections. He's protected." Martha nodded, understanding the truth of Sarah's words. Green was deeply embedded in the town's power structure, with friends and allies who would defend him. But Martha also knew that, for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone in this fight. The days that followed were tense. Martha and her group worked tirelessly, gathering signatures, speaking to neighbors, and sharing their stories. Some people supported them openly, while others offered only quiet encouragement, fearful of reprisal. The whispers of resistance spread through the town, filling the air with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something was about to change. But Green was not one to be outdone. He seemed to sense the mounting opposition and responded with a quiet but relentless campaign of intimidation. Patrol cars began appearing outside the homes of those who had attended the meeting. Late-night knocks on doors, questions about suspicious activity, and veiled threats became common occurrences. The atmosphere in the town grew tense. A silent battle waged in the shadows as Green sought to maintain his grip on power. One evening, as Martha walked home from another meeting, she felt a familiar chill run down her spine. She turned a corner, only to find herself face to face with Green, his patrol car idling behind him. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, arms crossed, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Going somewhere, Martha?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Martha held her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "Just heading home," she replied, her voice steady. Green took a step closer, invading her personal space. "You know, Martha, some people don't know when to quit. They stir up trouble, thinking they're doing something noble, and all they end up doing is making life harder for themselves." She met his gaze, unflinching. "If anyone's making life harder for the people in this town, it's you, Officer Green." A flicker of anger crossed his face, and for a moment Martha saw the raw hatred lurking beneath his polished exterior. "Careful, Martha," he said softly. "You wouldn't want something unfortunate to happen." Martha felt her heart race, but she refused to back down. She held his gaze, letting him see the determination in her eyes. "I'm not afraid of you, Green. You can try to scare me, but I've been through worse, and I won't stop until justice is done." Green's expression darkened, but he stepped back, his mouth twisted into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning and walking back to his car. As he drove away, Martha felt a surge of relief mixed with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. In the days that followed, the campaign for justice continued, gaining momentum with each passing day. Martha's group managed to gather hundreds of signatures, enough to force the town council to acknowledge their concerns. But Green's intimidation tactics didn't let up, and each member of the group found themselves targeted in some way. Martha's home was vandalized one night, her windows broken and her front porch spray-painted with hateful messages. She awoke to find her small sanctuary defaced, a stark reminder of the battle she was fighting. But rather than deter her, the act of aggression only fueled her resolve. She repaired the damage herself, refusing to let Green and his allies see her weakened. As word of the campaign spread, more people joined their cause, bringing with them stories of injustice that painted a damning portrait of Green's actions. The momentum was undeniable, and Martha could feel the tide beginning to turn. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that, despite the odds, justice might finally be within reach. But she also knew that Green would not go down without a fight. The pressure he exerted on her and her supporters only intensified, and each day brought new challenges, new threats. The battle was far from over, but Martha was ready for whatever lay ahead. In the quiet moments of the night, as she prepared for the next day's fight, Martha found herself thinking of her parents, of the strength they had passed on to her. She knew that they would be proud of her, that they would stand beside her in spirit as she continued her fight for justice. And as she lay down to rest, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was no longer alone in this struggle. She had allies, friends, and a community that was finally beginning to awaken to the truth. Martha had chosen her path, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The town council meeting was packed that evening. Word had spread quickly that Martha's group had gathered enough signatures to demand an investigation, and the anticipation was palpable. The crowd was a mixture of those who believed in the cause, those who had come out of curiosity, and those who, like Green's allies, were there to intimidate and discourage. Martha sat near the front with Sarah by her side, her hands resting on a stack of papers that held the names of every person who had stood with her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the strength of the community behind her. This was the moment they had fought for, the culmination of their tireless efforts to expose the truth. The council members filed in, taking their seats with an air of authority. At the head of the table sat Mayor Hale, a man with a reputation for diplomacy, but known to turn a blind eye to unpleasant truths. His expression was impassive as he looked out at the crowd, his gaze briefly meeting Martha's before he looked away. The meeting began with the usual formalities, a droning litany of community updates and minor administrative matters. But the tension in the room was unmistakable, a coiled energy that only grew as the agenda approached the issue that had brought them all here. Finally, Mayor Hale cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he spoke. The next item on our agenda concerns a formal complaint against Officer Gerald Green and the request for an investigation into allegations of misconduct. He paused, his tone carefully neutral. Miss Martha Johnson has requested to speak on behalf of the complainants. All eyes turned to Martha as she rose, her movements steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm her. She held her head high, meeting the gaze of the council members with quiet defiance as she began to speak. "Thank you, Mayor Hale, and thank you to the members of the council," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm here tonight because the people of this town deserve to know the truth about the men who are supposed to protect us. Officer Green has used his position of authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harass innocent people. He has turned his badge into a weapon, a tool of fear rather than a symbol of safety." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of agreement and discomfort as Martha's words hung in the air. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "I've lived in this town my entire life. I've seen the good, the bad, and everything in between. But I never thought I would see the day when a person like Officer Green would be allowed to abuse his power without consequence." She paused, looking around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had come to support her. "We cannot let this continue. We cannot let fear dictate our lives." As she spoke, Martha felt a surge of strength, a feeling of purpose that lifted her above the fear and doubt. She glanced at Sarah, who gave her an encouraging nod, and at Jacob, who sat nearby, his eyes filled with admiration and respect. They were all here because of her, because she had chosen to stand up, to break the silence that had kept so many in fear. One of the council members, a stern-faced man named Willis, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Miss Johnson, while I respect your perspective, do you have any concrete evidence to support these allegations? Officer Green has served this community for years. It's hard to believe he would act in the way you describe." Martha held up the stack of signed papers, her voice unwavering. "This is the testimony of every person who has been affected by Officer Green's actions. Every name on this list represents a story of fear, of intimidation, of harassment. We may not have video footage or audio recordings, but we have the truth, and that is more powerful than any badge." Willis shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Mayor Hale, who remained expressionless. The tension in the room grew as the silence stretched, the weight of Martha's words settling over the council members like a heavy shroud. And then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through the quiet. "I have a story to share." The crowd turned to see Emma, the single mother who had spoken at one of the group's earlier meetings. She stepped forward, her face pale but resolute, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. My son was harassed by Officer Green. He was only 16. Green stopped him on his way home from school, accused him of being up to something just because he was walking alone. He scared my son so badly that he didn't want to leave the house for weeks. He wouldn't even go to the store for me. Emma's voice cracked, but she pressed on, her eyes bright with determination. No one should have to live in fear, especially not a child. And I won't stand by and let this happen to anyone else. Her words struck a nerve, the truth of her pain resonating with the crowd. A murmur of agreement swept through the room as more people began to speak up, sharing their own stories, each one adding to the mountain evidence against Green. Councilman Willis looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting in his seat as more and more voices joined the chorus of complaints. Mayor Hale raised his hand, calling for order, but the momentum had already taken hold. People were no longer content to sit in silence, no longer willing to ignore the wrongs that had plagued their town. And then, as the room fell into a tense hush, the doors swung open and Officer Green himself entered. He walked with a smug confidence, his gaze sweeping over the crowd as if daring them to continue. He took his place at the front of the room, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. Martha felt a surge of anger as she looked at him, her resolve hardening. She would not back down. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. Green addressed the council with a calm, practiced tone, his words laced with barely veiled contempt. Ladies and gentlemen, I have served this community for over a decade. I have dedicated my life to keeping this town safe. And now I'm being attacked by baseless accusations from people who don't understand the pressures of law enforcement. He paused, glancing at Martha, his expression cold and calculating. Miss Johnson here. She's mistaken. She's taken a simple misunderstanding and turned it into an attack on my character. I am a law-abiding officer, and I have done nothing but serve this town with honor. Martha clenched her fists, feeling the frustration rise within her as Green twisted the truth, turning himself into the victim. She knew his words were calculated, designed to sow doubt in the minds of the council members, but she also knew that she had the truth on her side. Sarah leaned over, whispering to Martha, "Don't let him intimidate you. We're here with you." Drawing strength from her allies, Martha stood up once more, addressing the council directly. Officer Green can deny these allegations all he wants, but the people in this room know the truth. They have lived it. This is not just a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of behavior, one that has hurt too many people for too long. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly torn between the accusations and Green's confident denials. Mayor Hale cleared his throat, his gaze flicking between Martha and Green. "This is a serious matter," he said slowly. "We can't make a decision based on words alone. We need to review all the evidence, hear from all parties involved, and conduct a thorough investigation. Only then can we determine the appropriate course of action." It wasn't the decisive victory Martha had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. The council had committed to an investigation, and that was more than she could have asked for only a few weeks ago. As the meeting drew to a close, Martha felt a sense of relief mingled with lingering uncertainty. She had fought with everything she had, and while the battle was far from over, She knew that the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. But as she left the meeting, she caught sight of Green standing by the door, his expression dark and threatening. He didn't say a word, but the message in his gaze was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Martha felt a chill run down her spine, but she squared her shoulders, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. With her allies by her side, she would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. As she walked out into the cool night air, Martha knew that the hardest part of the battle was still ahead. But she was ready for it, prepared to face whatever challenges lay in her path. She had found her voice, and she would not be silenced again. The days following the council meeting were filled with a tense, quiet anticipation. Rumors swirled around town about the investigation into Officer Green, and while some doubted that any real change would come, Martha and her group of supporters remained hopeful. The council had made a commitment to review the accusations, and for the first time there was a glimmer of accountability. But Green was not about to go down without a fight. He began appearing at unusual hours, shadowing Martha as she ran errands, waiting outside her home with his patrol car idling under the streetlights as though daring her to take the next step. His presence loomed over her like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the threat he posed. Yet Martha refused to let his intimidation tactics shake her resolve. Martha's group continued to meet in secret, sharing updates on the investigation and planning their next steps. Sarah, ever resilient, encouraged them to hold firm, reminding them that Green's desperation was proof that their actions were having an impact. Each meeting strengthened their resolve, and as the days passed, more people joined their cause, unwilling to remain silent in the face of injustice. Then, one crisp evening, Martha received a call from Mayor Hale. He sounded cautious, almost nervous, as he informed her that the investigation was complete and the council was ready to announce their decision. The news sent a ripple of anticipation through the group, and they agreed to gather at the council hall the following evening to hear the verdict together. The council hall was packed when they arrived, the atmosphere charged with expectation. Martha sat in the front row, flanked by Sarah and Jacob, her heart pounding as she waited for the proceedings to begin. Green was present too, seated with a group of his allies near the back of the room. His expression was calm, almost smug, as though he had already decided the outcome in his favor. The council members took their seats, and Mayor Hale stepped forward, clearing his throat as he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming. After a thorough review of the complaints and testimonies brought forth, we have reached a decision regarding Officer Green's conduct. This has not been an easy process, and we appreciate the patience of everyone involved." He paused, glancing at the crowd with a carefully neutral expression. "The council has determined that Officer Green's actions violated both the ethical standards of our police force and the trust placed in him by the community. Effective immediately, Officer Green will be relieved of his duties pending further investigation and disciplinary action." A murmur of shock and relief spread through the room, and Martha felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She looked at Sarah, who squeezed her hand with a smile, and at Jacob, who grinned, his eyes bright with pride. This was the victory they had fought for, the justice they had demanded. Green's face darkened as he rose to his feet, his composure unraveling. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice laced with fury. "I've given years to this town, protected these people, and this is how they repay me?" Mayor Hale raised his hand, his tone firm. "Officer Green, please sit down. The council has made its decision." But Green wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Martha, a dangerous gleam in his gaze. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me." Martha held his gaze, her own expression unyielding. She refused to let him intimidate her, not after everything she had fought for. She could feel the strength of her supporters around her, a united front that Green could no longer shake. The council meeting adjourned, and as the crowd began to disperse, Martha found herself surrounded by friends and neighbors, each offering words of support and gratitude. Emma, the mother whose story had helped fuel their fight, hugged Martha tightly, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you, Martha," she whispered. "You did this. You made this happen." Martha smiled, feeling the warmth of the community around her. "We did this, all of us. It was our voices together that made the difference." As she left the council hall that evening, Martha felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The fight had been long and painful, but it had been worth it. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and in doing so, had helped to bring justice to a town that had been silent for too long. The following weeks brought a new sense of hope to the town. Green's departure sent a powerful message, a reminder that no one was above accountability, that change was possible when people stood together. Martha's group continued to meet, turning their focus toward new goals, advocating for reform, supporting victims of injustice, and ensuring that the voices of the people would never again be silenced. One evening, as Martha walked through the now familiar park, she paused by the fountain, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She thought of her parents, of their quiet strength and resilience, and she knew they would be proud of the path she had chosen. The legacy they had passed down to her was one of courage, of never backing down in the face of adversity. And she would continue to honor that legacy, carrying their strength with her as she moved forward. As she stood there, Sarah approached, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to believe it's over," she said softly. Martha smiled, glancing at the young woman who had been her ally, her friend, through it all. "Not over," she replied, a hint of determination in her voice. "Just the beginning." Sarah nodded, her gaze filled with admiration. "You're right. There's still work to be done." They walked together through the park, side by side, the weight of the past lifting as they looked toward the future. Martha knew that the fight for justice would never truly end, but she was ready for it, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had found her voice, and with it she had found a new sense of purpose. As they reached the edge of the park, Martha looked back one last time, feeling the quiet strength of the town surrounding her. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and she knew that she was no longer alone. With her friends by her side, she would continue to stand for justice, for herself, and for all those who came after her. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of a new beginning. And as Martha walked home, she knew that the legacy of resilience and courage she had inherited would live on, carried forward by every voice that dared to speak against injustice. This was her victory, her legacy, and it was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new stories, and be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. There's more to come.